Number 1. Stephen Bryan Pennell. U.S. Route 40 in the state of Delaware is not a place people dream of visiting. There are no famous beaches, no dazzling tourist lights. It is just a long, straight road, quietly cutting through small towns where life moves slower, heavier, more worn down. For most people, it is simply a road to get to work, a road to go home. But for some women, Route 40 is where they are forced to step out every night, carrying a fragile hope that they will still be alive to return. They do not dream of wealth. They only hope for a meal, a roof over their heads, a tomorrow different from today. And then, amid the familiar sound of engines, beneath the cold glow of headlights, a man appears. He does not shout. He does not threaten. He simply opens the car door and asks a very ordinary question. Do you need a ride? No one knows that this will be the last question they ever hear. By the late 1980s, along Route 40 existed a world many people chose not to see. A world of women living on the margins of society, carrying broken pasts and an anxious present. They were not born to stand by the roadside on cold nights. Life pushed them there through poverty, domestic violence, addiction, or simply the absence of any other choice. Every night, they learned how to trade. To trade safety for rent money. To trade trust for a meal. Risk slowly became routine. Fear was pressed into silence. And in the darkness, they believed that if they were just a little more careful, a little more lucky, they would survive the night. What they did not know was that a man was watching patiently, waiting, seeing their fragility not as a tragedy, but as an opportunity. Stephen Bryan Pennell did not appear as someone to be feared. He fit perfectly into the familiar image of America in those years, a man with a steady job, a complete family, and a life that seemed entirely normal. Pennell was an electrician. Every morning, he went to work on time. In the evenings, he had dinner with his wife and their 2 young children. On weekends, he mowed the lawn, fixed the fence, and exchanged polite small talk with his neighbors. To everyone around him, he was a quiet husband, a father who wasn't loud but was responsible. No heavy drinking. No fights. No criminal record. No one knew that behind this calm exterior existed a completely different world. A man living 2 lives. Blending into the crowd by day, separating himself from every moral boundary by night. And it was this very ordinariness, so complete it became invisible, that concealed something terrifying. That evil does not always wear a monstrous face. Sometimes, it looks exactly like a man you could meet at any moment. Stephen Pennell's blue Ford Econoline did not draw attention. It looked like thousands of other electrician vans traveling America's roads every day. By day, the vehicle carried electrical wire, tools, and the familiar scent of grease and manual labor. It parked in front of ordinary homes, places where people believed everything was safe. But when night fell, the van became something else entirely. Inside were thick carpeting, sealed doors, and sounds swallowed whole. A place where no one could hear screams for help. To the women standing along Route 40, the blue van was a symbol of trust. A tradesman, a working man, someone who looked harmless. They did not know that when the door closed, the outside world disappeared with it. And from that moment on, the van was no longer just a means of transportation. It became the line between life and death. Shirley Ellis was not a name that made headlines. She was a 23-year-old woman, young, exhausted, and trying to rebuild her life one small step at a time. Shirley had made mistakes, but at that point in her life, she was studying to become a nurse. She wanted to care for others, to have a stable job, to escape the long nights filled with risk. On the evening of November 29, 1987, Shirley brought a Thanksgiving meal to an AIDS patient at Wilmington Hospital. It was a small act, but one rooted in compassion. When she left the hospital, Shirley only wanted to go home. She was tired. It was cold. And Route 40 was the fastest way back. The next morning, Shirley's body was found at a construction site. She had been bound, beaten, tortured before she died. Investigators quickly realized what chilled them the most. There were no signs of sexual assault. No sense of haste. Shirley's death was not the result of a moment of lost control. It was the product of calculation. And in that moment, Delaware understood something terrifying. A woman was dead. But a far greater nightmare had just begun. After the death of Shirley Ellis, nothing stopped. It had only just begun. 7 months later, 31-year-old Catherine DeMoro was found in a similar condition. The same method, the same restraints, the cruelty repeated with almost exact precision. Then came Margaret Lynn Finner. Then Michelle Gordon. Different names but the same ending. They were all women trying to survive one day at a time. Each carried her own story, her own fears, her own fragile hope that she would not be the next one. Investigators began to see a clear pattern. The killer returned to the same road, used the same approach, acted with the same cold calm. With each attack, the level of violence increased. These were no longer impulsive acts, they were practice. And now, Delaware had no doubt. They were facing a serial killer, one who learned from his victims and had no intention of stopping. As the number of victims grew, Delaware police realized they could not do this alone. The FBI was brought in. Behavioral experts examined the smallest details, the approach, the timing, the steadily escalating level of violence. They began to sketch the profile of a calculated predator. A man with a stable job, well integrated into society, and patient enough to wait. By day, he lived like an ordinary citizen. He had a family, responsibilities. He drew no attention. By night, he stepped out of that shell, seeking the most vulnerable people and turning them into targets. Not in haste, not in impulse. The experts called him a man living two lives. One life in the light, designed to deceive the world, and another in the dark, where he believed he had the right to control the lives of others. And the most frightening conclusion in the file was brutally clear. This man would not stop on his own. If he was not stopped, he would keep killing. To stop the nightmare, investigators were forced to make a dangerous decision. They needed to approach the killer in the only way he understood. Officer Renee Tashner was chosen. She stood alone along Route 40 in the cold night, wearing a hidden recording device beneath her clothes. Renee understood the risk. One small mistake, and she could become the next victim. Before long, the blue van appeared. It passed by, then turned around, then turned again. 7 passes in less than 20 minutes. When the vehicle finally stopped, the man inside looked at Renee with a calm, unhurried gaze. The conversation was disturbingly normal. But in that moment, Renee felt that something was deeply wrong. A look that did not see her as a person, but as a choice. She studied the interior of the van, the carpeting, the enclosed space. When the man urged her to get inside, Renee refused. The van drove away, but the cold feeling remained. And for the first time, the monster had left a trace. The license plate was recorded in the darkness. And this time, evil had nowhere left to hide. Stephen Brian Pennell was brought into focus. A husband, a father, an ordinary electrician. When the search warrant was executed, the blue van was thrown open. What lay inside left investigators frozen. The thick carpeting matched fibers found on the victims' bodies. Traces of dried blood, strands of hair caught in dark corners. And then they saw the tools. Pliers, handcuffs, a whip, a knife. The items were neatly arranged, cold, methodical, as if they had been used many times before. There was no more doubt, no more theory. In that moment, every question had its answer. The monster had not come from some distant place. It had been living among them all along, wearing the face of an ordinary man. Stephen Brian Pennell was arrested without any resistance. No attempt to run, no panic. He stood there calmly, as if he had always known this moment would come. In the interrogation room, Pennell said very little. He did not confess, but he showed no fear. In court, he maintained the same cold, emotionless expression, like a man watching someone else's story unfold. The trial lasted for weeks. Evidence from the van, the carpet fibers, the blood traces, each piece, was laid out before the scales of justice. The victims could no longer speak, but what they left behind told the entire truth. When the death sentence was pronounced, the courtroom fell silent. Pennell did not object. If anything, he accepted it in a way that was deeply unsettling. In 1992, Stephen Bryan Pennell was executed. He took with him secrets that were never spoken questions the victims' families would never have answered. Justice was carried out according to the law. But the pain did not disappear. For those left behind, time did not close the wound. It only taught them how to live with the loss. Number 2. Thomas Capano. Delaware is a place where power is often believed to come with respect. Men in tailored suits, speaking calmly, appearing in courtrooms, are seen as symbols of law and order. But sometimes, those who understand the law best are the ones who know how to hide crime most carefully. On a summer evening in 1996, Anne Marie Fahey, the young secretary to the governor of Delaware, left her office and never returned. No cry for help, no witnesses, only an unsettling absence in the life of a 30-year-old woman and a powerful man who claimed he knew nothing. Thomas Capano, a lawyer, a political advisor, a name no one ever expected to be associated with murder. But the truth sometimes hides behind the most elegant doors. Anne Marie Fahey was not someone who sought attention. She worked hard, lived with discipline, and believed that effort would lead to a better future. As the governor's secretary, Anne was accustomed to pressure late meetings, professional silence, and the expectation of absolute discretion. She had friends, a loving family, a life that seemed to be moving in the right direction. But Anne also carried a very human loneliness. And it was that vulnerability that drew her into a dangerous relationship with a man far older than her, far more powerful, and deeply accustomed to control. In that world, power rarely speaks out loud. It works quietly, binding others to its will. Thomas Capano was the embodiment of success. Born into a prominent family, highly educated, well-connected, he was a renowned lawyer, an advisor to Delaware's top political figures. A man who knew exactly what people wanted to hear and always appeared where he needed to be. Capano had a family, children, status, but behind that perfect image was a man who could not accept rejection. To Capano, everything in life was something to be controlled, including people. And when Anne Fahey decided to end the relationship, Capano did not see it as her choice. He saw it as betrayal. On the day Anne disappeared, Capano claimed they had only talked that everything ended peacefully. But Anne's car was found in a parking lot. Her purse was still inside, her keys untouched. Her phone went silent, not a single call. Anne's family began to panic. Police began asking questions, and Thomas Capano's name surfaced not as a victim, but as the last person known to have seen Anne alive. Inside his luxurious apartment, Capano had already prepared a plan. A cold, deliberate plan, crafted by a man who understood exactly how to evade the law. Capano shot Anne in his apartment. Not in panic, but in control. He placed her body into a large cooler, called his brother to help. Told him it was simply something that needed to be taken care of. In the middle of the night, they carried the cooler out to sea, dropped it into deep water. Capano believed that without a body, there would be no crime. But he forgot one thing. The ocean can swallow a body, but it cannot erase every trace of guilt. Investigators never found Anne's body, but they found contradictions, changing statements, deleted phone calls, small details Capano believed no one would notice. Slowly, the picture came into focus. A secret relationship. A man who could not accept rejection. A plan to make someone disappear. There was no body, but there was enough truth to bring charges. Thomas Capano's trial sent shockwaves through Delaware. For the first time, a man with such power stood before the court as a defendant. The jury was not swayed by tailored suits or a calm, measured voice. They looked at the evidence and at what Anne Fahey had lost. Capano was convicted of murder. His death sentence was later reduced to life in prison. He died behind bars in 2011. There is no grave for Anne. No place for her family to leave flowers. Only a cold lesson remains. Power may hide the truth for a time, but it can never erase it forever. Number 3. Robert H. Richards IV. In October 2007, Delaware was not shaken by a murder. There was no bloody crime scene, no dramatic chase. There was only one question that sent a chill through the entire United States. How wealthy does a man have to be to avoid prison for sexually assaulting his own child? Robert H. Richards IV carried the DuPont name, a name that opened every door in Delaware. Million-dollar estates, vast trust funds, a prestigious family legacy. But behind the stone walls of luxury lay the trembling testimony of a 5-year-old girl and a sentence that forced justice to bow before money. Everything came to light when Richards's 5-year-old daughter spoke to her grandmother. Her words were innocent, halting but consistent. "Daddy touched me. Daddy said it was a secret." Child forensic experts were brought in. The interviews were gentle, non-leading, without pressure. The little girl told the same story repeatedly in different rooms to different professionals over the course of several years. This was not an accident, not a misunderstanding. It was repetition. A betrayal by the very person who was meant to protect her. Delaware police proceeded with caution. They understood exactly who they were dealing with. There was no clear physical evidence, something tragically common in cases of child sexual abuse. But the victim's testimony was consistent. Experts confirmed there were no signs of coaching or suggestion. Richards was charged with 2 counts of child sexual assault. Each count carried a mandatory minimum sentence of 10 years in prison. 20 years. If he had been an ordinary man, the story would likely have ended there. Richards's attorneys entered the courtroom with the greatest advantage of all: money. Prosecutors faced an impossible choice: take the case to trial and risk losing, or accept a plea deal that guaranteed a conviction. In the end, they chose the safer path. Richards pleaded guilty to a reduced charge. No mandatory prison sentence. Not a single day behind bars. 8 years of probation. As the judge read the sentence, the courtroom fell silent. A child had been abused, and the man responsible walked out free. The case was barely reported at first until the court records were made public. Then, the entire nation erupted in outrage. Comparisons were drawn to poor defendants serving long prison sentences for far lesser crimes. People asked the question out loud: if he didn't carry the DuPont name, would Richards have walked out of court smiling? The judge required security protection. Prosecutors were forced to explain their decision. But no one could explain to the victim why her father was still free. Richards returned to his mansion. The money kept flowing. Life went on. But the children carried wounds that would last a lifetime. The case forced Delaware to change its sentencing guidelines. It forced society to confront an uncomfortable truth. The law is not blind, but sometimes it is blinded by money. Robert H. Richards IV did not become a killer, but he became the symbol of something even more frightening: absolute inequality before justice. Number 4. Christopher Rivers. On the night of September 22, 2013, the Paladin Club apartment complex in Wilmington was quiet, like any other night. No one knew that within minutes, it would become the scene of a massacre. Joseph Connell and his newlywed wife, Olga, had just returned home after a birthday dinner. They were laughing, talking about the future. Just 128 days earlier, they had stood at the altar, believing their new life was only beginning. But in the darkness, someone was already waiting. Not an enemy, not a stranger, but a man who shook Joseph's hand every day at work. Christopher Rivers. Joseph Connell was a hard-working mechanic. He built his auto repair shop from nothing through skill, effort, and a belief in honest work. Olga, his Russian wife, left her homeland for love. She learned to adapt, learned to dream of building a life together. They were not wealthy, but they were happy. Christopher Rivers was part of that world too. He was Joseph's business partner, someone trusted enough to share debts, profits, and plans for the future. But between them existed something more dangerous than any disagreement greed. When the business began to struggle, Rivers started to change. Crystal meth robbed him of sleep, fed his paranoia, and turned suspicion toward everyone around him. In Rivers's mind, Joseph was no longer a partner. He became an obstacle. Rivers discovered the life insurance policies they had signed at the bank's request. If Joseph died, the money would go to Rivers. From that moment on, the question was no longer if. It was when. Rivers began looking for someone to kill Joseph, as if arranging a murder were just another business transaction. Rivers reached out to Joshua Bay, a broker with connections to the street crime world. Bay brought in 2 young gunmen, men already familiar with violence. The deal was simple: $60,000. One life. Rivers tracked Joseph through text messages, checked in like a friend, sent birthday wishes to Olga. But in reality, it was surveillance. Timing, choosing the moment to strike. When Joseph texted that he was on his way home, Rivers forwarded the location immediately. The death sentence had been delivered. As Olga put the key into the door, gunshots erupted. No warning, no mercy. Joseph was hit and collapsed into the bushes. His phone was still in his hand, as if he had been hoping to call someone. Olga fell at the doorway. She never had the chance to fully live the life of a wife. More than 20 shots. 2 lives ended. 1 dream erased. The hired killers vanished into the night. And Rivers, elsewhere, pretended to know nothing. Police quickly realized this was not a random robbery. There was no personal altercation. No sign of a crime of opportunity. They traced the phones, the messages, the cell tower data. Christopher Rivers's name appeared too often. At exactly the right moments. Too perfectly timed to be coincidence. Facing a long prison sentence, Joshua Bay broke his silence. He confessed to the entire plot, every call, every message. The final curtain was pulled back. The 2016 trial left no room for doubt. Rivers was convicted of first-degree murder. 2 consecutive life sentences. No possibility of parole. Rivers showed no remorse. He continued to see himself as a victim of circumstance. But Joseph and Olga were given no second chance. The Paladin Club case left behind a bitter lesson. The most dangerous person is not always a stranger in the dark. Sometimes, it is the person you trust, the most, the one who once called you a partner. Number 5. Brian Steckel. On the afternoon of September 2, 1994, at the Driftwood Club apartment complex in Newark, Delaware, nothing seemed out of the ordinary. No screams. No signs of danger. Just a knock at the door. Sandra Lee Long, 29 years old, faced a decision millions of people have made at some point in their lives: opening the door to let a stranger use the phone. An act of kindness. A deeply human reflex. She did not know that behind that door stood a man who had spent an entire week choosing her as his victim. And just hours later, the name Sandra Lee Long would become a haunting memory across the state of Delaware. Sandra was a young woman living independently. She worked hard, had friends, and plans for the future. Her small apartment was not far from the city center, a place that felt safe enough to believe there was nothing to fear during the day. Sandra was not looking for trouble. She was not part of the criminal world. She was simply someone who believed kindness still existed. And that belief was exploited with brutal cruelty. Brian Steckel was 25 years old, tall, heavily built, working as a laborer. His nickname was Red. He was a severe alcoholic, constantly craving attention, carrying violent fantasies within him. In Wilmington bars, Red was known for his temper. One punch was often enough to end any argument. But behind that aggressive exterior was a predator, a man who craved control, and one who had been imagining murder long before he ever acted. Steckel did not act on impulse. He watched Sandra for an entire week, memorizing her routines, the times she was home. He came prepared. A strangulation cord. A lie ready to tell. When Sandra opened the door, Steckel pretended he needed to use the phone. Then he pulled the plug from the wall. There would be no call for help. From that moment on, the apartment became a prison. And Sandra became prey. Sandra fought back. She bit into his hand until it bled, a desperate instinct to survive. Steckel strangled her with a nylon stocking. When it snapped, he replaced it with another. When Sandra lost consciousness, he dragged her into the bedroom. Then he set the apartment on fire. He left her there, surrounded by smoke and flames. Sandra died from smoke inhalation and severe burns. 60% of her body was burned. A death so brutal it defies description. A few hours later, the News Journal newsroom received a phone call. A man's voice, calm, almost casual. "I'm the Driftwood Killer." He described the crime scene in detail. Then he threatened the next victim. Police understood then that they were not just hunting a murderer. They were dealing with someone who wanted to be seen. Someone who wanted to be remembered. Brian Steckel was arrested just 1 day later. Drunk. Aggressive. He confessed with pride. The bite marks on his hand matched Sandra's. Evidence that could not be denied. The trial exposed the full depth of his brutality. In 2005, Brian Steckel was executed. His lethal injection sparked controversy. But no debate could erase the truth. Sandra Lee Long died for a single act of kindness, opening her door to a stranger. The case became a chilling warning. Sometimes, evil does not hide in the shadows. It stands right at your doorstep, in broad daylight. Number 6. Keith Gibson. In April 2021, the state of Delaware woke up in horror. Not because of a single crime, but because of a chain of deaths that unfolded in less than 24 hours. Neighbors heard no arguments. Saw no warning signs. It wasn't until police knocked on the doors that they learned the truth. Inside those familiar homes were the bodies of innocent people. What shocked the public was not only the number of victims, but a chilling question that followed: why was the killer allowed to walk free in society, when his past had repeatedly warned that this tragedy was coming? His name was Keith Gibson. Keith Gibson was no stranger to police. He had a long history of serious violence. Assaulting his ex-wife, threatening to kill, violating restraining orders. Each time he was arrested, Gibson was released probation, supervision, another chance to rebuild a life he never chose to take. The system believed that with enough conditions in place, Gibson could control himself. But there are some people who do not need more chances. They need to be stopped. The people around Gibson were not his enemies. They were family. Neighbors, people who had tried to help him. Among them was Gibson's own mother, a woman who had lived her entire life in fear and hoped that her son would change. None of them knew that the anger building inside Gibson had crossed every limit, that the threats he had made years earlier were not empty words. And that tragedy was closing in. In less than a single day, Keith Gibson struck again and again. No elaborate planning, no attempt to hide. Just pure violence. The victims were shot at close range inside their own homes, the very places that should have been safest. By the time police grasped the full scale of what was happening, the death toll was beyond saving. At least 6 lives were taken. Among them was the woman who had given birth to Gibson. A final boundary had been crossed. In the end, Keith Gibson was taken into custody. No further shots were fired. No violent resistance. He lowered his head, exhausted. There was no apology, no visible remorse. Standing before police was a man who had destroyed too many lives, and behind him stood a system now facing fierce questions about how it had failed to stop him. Delaware declared a state of emergency. Police sealed off multiple areas. Residents were told to stay inside. Schools were closed. Keith Gibson was placed on a statewide manhunt. He was armed and had nothing left to lose. The search stretched on for hours, heavy with tension. Every passing minute carried the risk of another life lost. In the end, Keith Gibson was taken into custody. No further shots were fired. No violent resistance. He lowered his head, exhausted. There was no apology, no visible remorse. Standing before police was a man who had destroyed too many lives, and behind him stood a system now facing fierce questions about how it had failed to stop him. Keith Gibson was sentenced to multiple consecutive life terms. He will never be free again. But that sentence cannot bring the victims back. The case forced Delaware to re-examine how it handles offenders with long histories of serious violence, parole decisions, early releases, and warnings that went unheeded. Keith Gibson was not just a murderer. He was proof of what happens when red flags are ignored. When the system fails, it is the innocent who pay the highest price. Number 7. The Matusiewicz family. On the morning of February 11, 2013, the family court in New Castle County opened its doors like any other day. People came to resolve disputes, sign paperwork, and make decisions about their children. No one imagined that this place would become the scene of a cold-blooded killing. Christine Belford walked into the courthouse with a close friend. She was not running. She was not afraid. She believed the law would protect her. Just minutes later, gunshots rang out. And for the first time, the entire United States was forced to confront a new reality. Hatred no longer needed knives or guns at the beginning. Sometimes, it started with words on a screen. Christine Belford once had a family she believed was ordinary: a husband, children, a home. But her marriage to Thomas Matusiewicz quickly turned into a nightmare. Jealousy, control, threats. Christine left the marriage to protect her children. She believed distance would bring safety. But Thomas could not accept being left behind. To him, Christine was not allowed to leave. And from that moment on, hatred took root. The Matusiewicz family did not turn to physical violence right away. They used the internet, hundreds of emails, thousands of posts, websites created to smear and defame. Christine was watched, accused, threatened every single day. Her life was torn apart piece by piece. They called it a campaign, a war without gunfire. But for Christine, it was psychological terrorism, a constant fear with no escape. Christine asked for help again and again. She went to the police, she stood before the court. But online threats were dismissed as minor. No wounds, no blood. And so, no one intervened in time. The system failed to understand that violence does not always begin with an act. Sometimes, it begins with obsession, slow, relentless, and allowed to grow unchecked. That morning, Thomas Matusiewicz walked into the courthouse with a gun hidden beneath his coat. He was not panicked. He did not hesitate. When he saw Christine, he opened fire. Then he shot the friend who was with her. In just a few seconds, a life was taken. A mother lost her chance to protect her children. Thomas then turned the gun on himself, right there at the scene. Hatred ended in the most brutal way possible. After the shooting, the FBI stepped in. They were not just investigating a murder, they were investigating a harassment campaign that had lasted for years. Members of the Matusiewicz family were charged with stalking and cyber harassment. For the first time in U.S. history, cyberstalking was recognized as a direct cause of a death. A legal precedent was set, written in blood. The Matusiewicz family was sentenced to many years in prison. But Christine Belford could not be brought back. Her 2 children grew up without their mother. The case changed how America views online violence, that words alone can kill, and that the system's silence can be just as dangerous as the person holding the gun. Christine Belford did not die from a single bullet alone. She died from hatred that was allowed to grow for far too long. A costly lesson for the internet age. Number 8. James B. Clark Jr. On the night of September 29, 1993, in a small house in Milford, Delaware, there were no prolonged screams, no chase, no warning signs. Just 2 people who believed they were giving someone a final chance. James and Shirley Clark, an elderly couple, opened their door to welcome back their adopted son after years in prison. They believed time had been long enough to heal the past. That forgiveness could change a person. But only hours later, that very home became the scene of a double homicide. And America was forced to ask a difficult question: are there some people who should never be given another chance? James B. Clark Jr. was not a first-time offender. At just 16 years old, he murdered a 3-year-old girl. The crime shocked the entire state. But because he was a juvenile, Clark received a sentence of 21 years in prison. Throughout his rehabilitation records, Clark showed no genuine remorse. Psychological evaluations repeatedly warned of a high risk of reoffending. But time passed. And with time came the belief that people can change. After serving 21 years, James B. Clark Jr. was released. The decision was based on legal statutes, not emotion. Warnings were set aside. Risk assessments were filed away. Clark returned to live with the couple who had adopted him, people who still believed that family could restrain violence. They did not know that the rage and deviance within Clark had never disappeared. It had only been sleeping. Just 30 days after his release, Clark struck. There was no major argument. No visible warning signs. James Clark murdered his own adoptive parents inside the familiar home, the very people who had given him shelter, food, and a chance to return to society. The act was swift, cold, decisive. Once again, Clark crossed the final boundary. And this time, there was no excuse that could justify it. After the murders, Clark fled. Delaware police launched a large-scale manhunt. Residents were warned to stay indoors. Schools were temporarily closed. Eventually, Clark was captured. No resistance, no remorse. Standing before police was a man who had been given every chance and had betrayed every single one. The trial unfolded under a heavy, somber atmosphere. Jurors were reminded of Clark's crime from years earlier. This time, society was no longer willing to take risks. There was no hope left for rehabilitation. James B. Clark Jr. was sentenced to death, a verdict that reflected the public's fear and outrage. In 1996, Clark was executed. The case of James B. Clark Jr. became a symbol in the debate over parole and rehabilitation. It forced Delaware to tighten its standards for releasing violent offenders. 2 people died because of trust, because of the hope that a person could change. But this case reminds society of a difficult truth. Not every mistake can be undone. Not every person should be given a second chance. Sometimes, the system's wrong decision is paid for with the lives of the innocent. Number 9. Billy Bailey. On the morning of January 25, 1996, a prison in Delaware prepared for a ritual it never expected to repeat. Not lethal injection. Not the electric chair. But a rope. Billy Bailey, 49 years old, stepped out of his cell with a sentence already sealed. He chose a method of death that America was trying to leave behind. As the execution chamber door closed, a chapter in the nation's criminal history was about to turn. But before the name Billy Bailey became associated with the final use of hanging as a form of execution, 2 innocent people had already died because of an impulsive decision and ruthless greed. Richard and Martha Carter were an elderly farming couple. They lived quietly, worked hard, and believed that rural Delaware was a safe place. They were not wealthy. They had no enemies. They were not part of the criminal world. For them, trusting other people came naturally, and it was that trust, unquestioned and sincere, that placed them in danger without them ever realizing it. Billy Bailey was a man with a deeply violent past. An alcoholic. A drug addict. He had spent years drifting without a stable place to live. He lived by impulsive decisions, carrying a lifetime of accumulated anger. On that fateful day, Bailey did not have a long-term plan. He needed money. And he needed a car to get out of the state. Billy Bailey broke into the Carters' home. There was no prolonged confrontation, no drawn-out argument, only the panic of 2 elderly people facing a desperate man. Bailey shot them at close range, stole their pickup truck, and drove away as if nothing had happened. 2 lives ended because of a single decision to escape faster. Police quickly tracked the stolen vehicle. Billy Bailey was arrested just hours later. There was no denial, no convincing excuse. Standing before investigators was a man who had crossed every moral boundary and had no way back. Bailey was sentenced to death, but he was given the right to choose the method of execution. Instead of lethal injection, Bailey chose hanging. The decision stunned the nation. It forced the legal system to revive a punishment long considered outdated and brutal. On the day of the execution, Observers called it a historic moment, not out of sympathy for Bailey, but because America was witnessing the end of an era. Billy Bailey became the last person to be legally hanged in the United States. After him, the practice was abolished entirely. The two victims he killed could never be brought back, but Bailey's death changed the law. The case serves as a reminder that justice must always walk alongside humanity, and that decisions made in desperation can leave consequences far beyond a single lifetime. Billy Bailey was not just a murderer. He was the final punctuation mark on a blood-stained chapter of American judicial history. Number 10. Shannon Johnson. On the night of April 6, 1996, in a quiet residential neighborhood in Milford, Delaware, there were no prolonged sirens, no immediate chaos. Only gunshots cutting through the darkness, shattering the calm of a small town. James Foraker collapsed right in front of his home. He had no time to run, no time to understand why he had become a target. Not far away, a woman was shot and critically wounded, but she survived. And she knew exactly who had pulled the trigger. His name was Shannon Johnson, a man who had carried violence with him his entire life. And that night, Delaware entered the final chapter of the death penalty. Shannon Johnson was no stranger to the justice system. He grew up surrounded by poverty, violence, and anger that was never controlled. Johnson had a long record of assault, threats, and weapons offenses. Each time he was released from prison, he returned to the same path. He saw violence as the solution to every problem. And he treated other people's lives as something he could take, whenever rage took over. No one in the community believed Johnson could change. The only question was when he would cause the next tragedy. The woman who survived was Johnson's former girlfriend, a relationship marked by control and threats. When she decided to leave him, Johnson could not accept it. To him, rejection was humiliation. That night, he brought a gun. Not to talk but to punish. James Foraker, her new boyfriend, became a victim simply for standing in the path of a man who could not tolerate losing control. Johnson arrived at the neighborhood under cover of night. He did not hide. He did not hesitate. The shots were fired at close range. Foraker died where he fell. The woman tried to run but was still hit. She collapsed and pretended to be dead in order to survive. Johnson walked away, believing no one had lived to testify. But fate spared one crucial witness. Police did not take long to identify the suspect. Johnson's name was already well known in their files. The surviving witness told her story clearly, consistently, without hesitation. Johnson was arrested shortly afterward, still in possession of the weapon. This time, there was no room for doubt. No reason left for leniency. Shannon Johnson's trial unfolded under a heavy atmosphere. Prosecutors laid out his long history of violence. The jury did not take long to reach a verdict. Johnson was sentenced to death. The sentence reflected society's fear and anger toward a repeat offender who could not be controlled. Delaware still had the death penalty at the time, but its final days had begun. In 2012, Shannon Johnson was executed by lethal injection. He became the last person put to death in the state of Delaware. 4 years later, the death penalty in Delaware was ruled unconstitutional. Johnson's case marked the end of an era of capital punishment, but not the end of the victim's pain. James Foraker could never be brought back. The woman who survived carried the memory for the rest of her life. Shannon Johnson was not just a murderer. He was the final reminder that when violence is not stopped in time, the price is always human life. And sometimes, justice arrives too late to protect those who should have been safe.